The proposed explanation for the universe sounds a lot like God, is not compelling at all because God is a specific invention, in many cases, to explain the things that we don't know. Every time there's something we don't know, we stick God in there. And if God can be an explanation for anything, it's an explanation for nothing. As a matter of fact, it has no explanatory power. It is functionally identical to saying it's magic. Because we tend to explain the unknown in terms of things that we know.
Hey everybody, welcome back. Grab a seat because this one is a proper heavyweight matchup. Tonight we're at Truett Seminary on the Baylor campus, and Matt Dillahunty is sitting across from Dr. Braxton Hunter to settle one question: does the Christian God exist? Braxton walks in with free will, the Kalam, and a stack of scholars to back up the resurrection. Matt walks in with a very simple demand that ends up shaking the whole table. Show me the data, not somebody's opinion about the data. I'd really encourage you to ride this one out to the last minute, because the piece that does the most damage isn't the loudest line, it's a quiet one buried in the middle that completely reframes everything Braxton built. And I always love seeing where this channel reaches. Drop your city or country in the comments. It genuinely makes my day scrolling through them. Alright, let's get into it.
I'm just waiting on you to say go. Okay, I'm talking. And there's going to be a lot to get to because I've got to go through rebuttals and everything else. So he says he's just pointing to the evidence. I would dispute whether or not we've actually pointed to anything like evidence. What we pointed to is arguments that are interpreted in such a way. But early on he began with this notion about free will and determinism. And while I am on record as being a compatibilist, I've also done a video with Rationality Rules where he talked about that. That's almost too much to begin going into, but I will say that I don't accept that we have anything like libertarian free will. And so if you're going to propose that God is the best explanation for something that I don't think we have, I don't know how that can be convincing. I also don't know how you could demonstrate that I could have done otherwise. I can demonstrate that I feel like I could have done otherwise, but we don't have a way to rewind the clock to in fact show that I could have done otherwise. So how do you draw a distinction between the impression that you could have done otherwise and the fact that you could have done otherwise? Meanwhile, the notion of a God of classical theism, which would apply to Christianity as well, is in direct conflict with the notion of libertarian free will. Because if a God knows everything is going to happen and created the universe and chose the universe in which I'm an atheist as opposed to choosing a different universe, then I didn't get to make those choices. I still made those choices within the context of that universe, but it was decided before me. And when you have a Bible that says that everything goes according to God's plan and that he can actually make prophecy, you can't have prophecy unless God already knows how things are going to turn out. And all of this stands in dire conflict with the notion of libertarian free will. Now, that's not a problem for me because I don't think we have libertarian free will. But we're probably not going to be well suited to go down that path this evening. The next thing he presented was the Kalam cosmological argument. And as I pointed out many times, the Kalam cosmological argument is not an argument for the existence of God. God is not in the premises, God is not in the conclusion. Premise 1, everything that begins to exist has a cause for its existence. Premise 2, the universe began to exist. Conclusion, therefore the universe had a cause for its existence. That's the whole argument. Everything else that ties it to a God about saying, oh, that cause must be transcend space and time and be an agent. None of that is part of the Kalam cosmological argument. Those are assertions that are glommed on about things that I don't think that we can possibly know about what type of cause might be sufficient and necessary to explain the origin of the universe. So the Kalam cosmological argument is not in any way a proof for God. What it is it's a little hanging fruit that makes it seem like you're being reasonable because of course the universe had to have a cause, and then we go on and have a secondary conversation about the nature of that cause. I'm not convinced that we know enough to conclude what the origin of the universe is or how we ruled out things like universe creating Pixies or multiverse or anything else. I understand that in some of those cases it pushes it back, but just to say that, gosh, the proposed explanation for the universe sounds a lot like God, is not compelling at all because God is a specific invention, in many cases, to explain the things that we don't know. Every time there's something we don't know, we stick God in there. And if God can be an explanation for anything, it's an explanation for nothing. As a matter of fact, it has no explanatory power. It is functionally identical to saying it's magic. Because we tend to explain the unknown in terms of things that we know.
Okay, this is the part where the whole thing quietly falls apart, and I need you to catch it because it goes by fast. Matt says this: I don't accept that we have anything like libertarian free will, and so if you're going to propose that God is the best explanation for something that I don't think we have, I don't know how that can be convincing. And that is such a clean piece of reasoning. You have to understand what just happened structurally. Braxton built an entire opening around free will being real, obvious, undeniable. But an argument that depends on you already agreeing with the first step is not an argument, it's a handshake. If I walk up to you and say my dragon proves magic is real, the conversation is not about magic. It's about whether there's a dragon. Braxton never established the dragon. He assumed it, then charged admission for the ride. And here's what people don't realize about that whole free will setup. It was never a neutral philosophical question. It was a trap with two doors, and both of them said, believe on the other side. Agree you're free, and you get God. Disagree, and supposedly you can't rationally affirm anything, so you lose the right to argue at all. That is not a case for anything. That's a rhetorical maze. Then Matt gets to the Kalam and he does the thing I have wanted somebody to do on a stage for years. He says this: the Kalam cosmological argument is not an argument for the existence of God. God is not the premises. God is not the conclusion. Read that again. The most famous argument in Christian apologetic, the one that gets cited in every campus debate, the one that has its own animated videos, and the word God does not appear in it anywhere. Not in step 1, not in step 2, not in the conclusion. And Matt keeps going. He says the parts that tie it to a god are assertions that are glommed on. Glommed on. That's the perfect word for it. Because the actual argument stops at the universe had a cause, and then a completely separate list of adjectives gets stapled to the end of it, while everyone nods along like it came out of the same equation. Timeless, spaceless, powerful, a mind. None of that was earned. It was smuggled. This is why Matt's line lands so hard when he says a thing that explains anything, explains nothing. Because once your answer can absorb any question you throw at it, you have stopped explaining and started decorating.
Now, he also mentioned that if I can't defeat this argument about determinism, then you all have libertarian free will. That's just a fallacy. Whether or not I can defeat any argument is irrelevant to what kind of will you have or anything else. He mentioned that we have 0 counterexamples to this. We also have 0 examples of something not beginning to exist, of something existing necessarily eternally. We have 0 examples of anything that has been identified as beyond nature. I don't even know how we could begin to investigate the supernatural. We can investigate manifestations in nature, and we may come up with a model that allows us to conclude that these manifestations are caused by something outside of nature, but we're not there yet, and we have no way to confirm supernatural causation. This is the reason why science is not based in philosophical naturalism, it's based in methodological naturalism. Science methods cannot consider supernatural explanations. So when we talk about, hey, I'm just presenting the evidence, and the evidence is all around, and I don't think God's all that hidden, what we're presenting here would not fit in with science. By the way, it also would not fit in a courtroom because we no longer allow spectral evidence in a courtroom. These are places where we learn how to live our lives and come up with new inventions. Courtrooms are places where we decide life and death decisions, and that should be good enough. I would think that if God can't stand up in a court of law or under the scrutiny of scientific rigor and critical thinking to where there's actual evidence for it, then certainly we would have to admit that we are using some alternate way of knowing that is necessarily on weaker footing than science in courtrooms. Now, this notion that he brings up about recalibrated plausibility, yes, I completely agree. And the way you recalibrate plausibility is to investigate and examine and come up with more data. And that can't happen for a single occurrence. It can't happen for historical events, though we can compare it to other ones. Thou shalt not put the Lord thy God to the test. Well, that already is going to prevent us from testing the Christian God appropriately. But when we try to test for this, when, for example, the Templeton Foundation does an investigation of intercessory prayer, what we find is that prayer doesn't work. It works at the rate of chance. And as a matter of fact, if you know you're being prayed for, those people did worse. The contention is that perhaps they had performance anxiety, that if they knew people were praying on them and they praying for them and they didn't get better, this would somehow mock God. So they actually got worse because of the stress is one thing.
And watch how fast Matt turns the evidence argument completely around. Braxton spent his opening telling the room that we have 0 counterexamples to things beginning to exist. Sounds powerful. Then Matt says this: we also have 0 examples of something not beginning to exist, of something existing necessarily eternally. That is the whole game right there. If counting examples is the standard, then the standard destroys both sides. You have never observed an eternal, timeless, non-material mind either. Not once. Not in a lab, not in a telescope, not anywhere. anywhere. So you cannot use our total lack of experience with uncaused things as proof, and then quietly exempt the one uncaused thing you happen to worship. Then Matt makes the point I think is the strongest thing he says all night. He says science methods cannot consider supernatural explanations. And then he takes it into the courtroom and says we no longer allow spectral evidence in a courtroom. Let me break down why that matters, because a lot of people hear spectral evidence and have no idea what it means. Back in 1692 in Salem, Massachusetts, courts actually accepted testimony where a person claimed they had seen someone's spirit or apparition tormenting them. No physical proof, no witnesses in the ordinary sense, just a claim about the invisible. And people were convicted on it. That October, Governor William Phips shut the whole court down. The following year, the minister Increase Mather published an argument that unverifiable spiritual testimony could never be enough to convict anyone. That is documented history, and it is why that category is dead in law today. So think about what Matt is really saying. The strictest thing our society ever built, the one place where we decide a person's entire future, threw this type of reasoning out more than 300 years ago. And we're being asked to accept it for the biggest claim anyone can make about reality. And then the prayer study. He mentions the Templeton Foundation looking at intercessory prayer, but he moves so fast that a lot of viewers won't know what he's pointing at. It's the study published in the American Heart Journal back in 2006, following around 1,800 cardiac bypass patients across 6 different hospitals. Real people, real doctors, real methodology. And the group being prayed for did not do better. That is what testing actually looks like. And that is exactly what never gets brought to these stages.
This notion about the moon landing, there are people who deny the moon landing. I'm not one of them. We've been to the moon. The Earth is not flat. Vaccines don't cause autism. This is stuff that you can actually look up and investigate, and you will find data. And in many cases, these are things that we can do multiple trials on. Now, the bedrock facts and the minimal facts and Gary Habermas's thing, first of all, there are people who don't think that Jesus existed, the mythicists. I don't think they're on particularly good footing, because it's not really that unusual to think that there's an itinerant Jewish rabbi in the first century, because there were loads of them. But the facts that they're presenting as minimal facts aren't confirmable. And so what we're doing is saying, he said, well, no, you might not want an assessment from a Christian theologian, you might not want an assessment from an atheist, you maybe want one from a Hindu. I don't want assessments from anybody. I want data. I want evidence, because every single one of those things cited, whether it came from an atheist, a Jew, a Hindu, or a Christian, is their opinion about what happened. I want the data that leads to that opinion. That's how we determine whether or not it's reasonable, not because I can cite more references for my idea, because the truth of a proposition isn't impacted in any way by the number of people who believe it, or the sincerity of their convictions, or how many other people agree with their opinions. Now, I agree that we shouldn't be trying to do group psychology on people from 2,000 years ago, which should point out that we also can't conclude that they were honest and reasonable, well represented, accurately presented, and that we should accept it. That's also an assessment of that. There are people who would die for a lie. I'm not assessing that anybody did or needed to die for a lie, because what we have are claims, and we have a dearth of evidence to actually be able to investigate and reach a reasonable conclusion on that.
And here comes the moment I think a lot of Christians in that room genuinely did not expect. Braxton had built this beautiful wall of names, scholar after scholar after scholar. A Christian one, an atheist one, a Jewish one, a liberal one, stacked up like a fortress. And then Matt just says this, I don't want assessments from anybody. I want data. I want evidence. That is devastating. And I don't think everybody caught why. Because a citation is not a piece of evidence. A citation is a person's opinion about evidence. When you quote a historian saying this event definitely happened, you have not handed me the event. You've handed me their confidence about it. Those are two completely different objects, and apologetics blurs them constantly. And Matt drives the nail in when he says the truth of a proposition isn't impacted in any way by the number of people who believe it, which is just true. Painfully, boringly true. You could line up 10,000 experts behind a claim, and the universe does not care. Consensus is a signal worth paying attention to. Absolutely. It is not a proof. Those are different things, and treating them as the same thing is how you end up defending something for centuries without ever checking the floor underneath it. Now, let me give you the context nobody on that stage bothered to explain, because if you're new to this, you'd be lost. That minimal facts approach Braxton is leaning on comes from a scholar named Gary Habermas, who started cataloging what published academics say about this subject back in 1975. That is genuinely enormous work, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But notice what the method actually measures. It measures what a body of scholars has written. It is a survey of published opinion, and Matt Matt's response cuts straight through it, because he says the facts being presented as minimal facts aren't confirmable. You cannot go check them. There is no artifact, no record, no independent trail to walk down. And then Matt does something I found really honest, which is that he refuses to play the game in the direction that would help him. He says we shouldn't be trying to do group psychology on people from 2,000 years ago, which should point out that we also can't conclude that they were honest. You see what he did? Braxton's side wants to say the people at the beginning were sincere, reliable, and accurately recorded. Matt's side has often wanted to say they were confused or hallucinating. Matt throws both out. He says we don't have access to either conclusion, and that takes discipline, because the easy move was to just assert the opposite story and call it a night. And that is the thread running through this entire stretch, and honestly through Matt's whole approach. Over and over he says I don't know, and people treat that like weakness, like he got cornered. But saying I don't know is the only honest thing you can say when the information genuinely isn't there, and I would rather stand next to somebody who admits the map runs out than somebody who draws in the rest of the coastline from memory. Because here's what really gets me about this exchange. Braxton is likable, he's sharp, he's funny, he's clearly sincere, and he prepared seriously. I have no interest in pretending otherwise, but every single one of his arguments needed you to accept something before the argument even started. Free will, already granted. The cause being a mind, already granted. The plausibility being recalibrated, already granted. And once you notice that, you can't unsee it. Matt didn't have to disprove anything. He just had to point at the foundation and ask what it's sitting on. And the answer, over and over, was other assumptions. That's not a debate loss for Braxton, because he argued badly. He argued, well, it's a loss, because you cannot reason your way to a conclusion using tools that were never tested. And after 2,000 years, somebody should have tested them by now. So what do you guys think of this? Leave your thoughts down in the comments. Please like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.